Hey everyone, this is Zinot. Today we're taking on a monument, The Last of Us. We're going to talk about architecture here, understand how the machine works, and why this game is technically an anomaly. I'm not going to tell you whether the game is good or bad. I trust you're all capable of forming your own opinion. My personal take would be irrelevant here. What we're interested in is the structure. From the very first minutes, this game presents itself as an intense dramatic experience. It wants to shock you, visually and emotionally. It piles on spectacular events, explosions, vehicles mowing down pedestrians, zombies appearing out of nowhere, people desperately trying to survive, others dying right in front of you. But scratch beneath that cinematic surface, and you realize this is not an organic world. The vast majority of these events rely on rigid scripts, and they show. This is the opposite of a game that generates situations dynamically. Here, everything is predetermined. The verdict is clear. The dramatic moments feel artificial and predictable. The player can sense the presence of an imposed screenplay, rather than a living world. Throughout this video, we're going to dissect these mechanics, to understand how this game is in reality, a theatre of automatons. A world where the player is guided mechanically, rather than surviving in a truly reactive universe. For a survival game to be credible, the player needs to believe in the space they're moving through. That's the whole challenge of level design, arranging levels to guide the player, while maintaining an illusion of immersion. The problem is that in this game, that illusion is technically very fragile. Visually, there are undeniable successes. There's a real artistic effort in certain interiors, with vegetation-covered walls and a refined handling of light, thanks to global illumination. That's the indirect light calculation that produces convincing reflections on surfaces. But the moment you step outside, that polish starts to crack. Assets don't always react coherently to the lighting. The image flattens out, and depth disappears. Back then, on PS3, RAM was extremely limited. To move from Zone A to Zone B without a loading screen, the studio used these slow movement sequences as disguised loading screens. While you're painfully pushing your palette, the engine is doing culling, clearing out the objects from the previous zone and loading in the new ones. These are points of no return, dictated by the machine, not by the story. And the most subtle variant of this mechanic is the instance transition. You know those moments where Joel squeezes between two walls, crawls under a fence, or climbs through a window in slow motion. Those aren't cinematic animations. They're disguised instance changes. The game is loading a new environment on the other side, while your camera is forced to stare at Joel's back against the wall. The gap between those two walls is literally the boundary between two memory zones. You're not crossing a set. You're waiting for the engine to switch from one space to another. Pure culling, hidden behind a body animation. This rigidity also shows in the scale, the size of objects. You'll regularly encounter trash cans or doors that don't match the proportions of the characters. That breaks what we call the suspension of disbelief. If the scale is wrong, the brain disconnects. Same goes for the crowd in the prologue. They sell you 30 people, but it's just 5 cloned NPC models filling the space. Finally, there's the physics. The game is riddled with clipping. objects passing straight through each other. Why? Because the studio had to limit rigid body collisions, the properties that make an object solid, to avoid overloading the processor. In summary, the environment of The Last of Us works like one giant optical illusion. It's a world made of closed corridors, where every mismatched scale and every clipping bug reminds us of a cold truth. We are not in a devastated city. We are inside a mechanical structure, struggling not to saturate the console's memory. If the world is nothing but a cardboard set, how do the actors who inhabit it behave? This is where systems engineering and artificial intelligence reveal their greatest limits. The AI of enemies and NPCs is truly the Achilles heel of this experience. Factual nuance is needed to be fair. In specific combat zones, the AI does show interesting behaviors. It knows how to flank you, communicate, and react to your shots. The game system works, but outside of these arenas, the vast majority of behaviors no longer rely on real-time decision-making. We shift into scripted AI, intelligence dictated by fixed lines of code. The patrols and reactions no longer adapt to you. They trigger solely because you crossed an invisible line. Technically, this is where we hit the limits of the nav mesh. That's the invisible grid on the ground that tells the AI where it's allowed to move. In this game, the AI seems incapable of calculating alternative paths autonomously outside of these strict rails. The result, faced with an unexpected situation, the enemy freezes or completely ignores your actions. Adaptive AI is virtually non-existent outside of combat scripts, but the most glaring issue is the omnipresence of the sequence trigger. If the player doesn't activate it, the world stops. A very concrete example. During the elevator sequence, certain allies remain completely motionless until you trigger the script at the exact right moment and place. The game turns basic movement actions into mandatory and frankly absurd events. You don't feel like you're cooperating with your allies. You feel like you need to validate a permission slip for them to be allowed to move. This is where another systemic manipulation comes in, ghosting, to mask the weaknesses of this nav mesh and prevent an ally from ruining your infiltration. The studio activated a disabled detection flag. Ellie can run right under a clicker's nose without triggering any reaction. Complete sacrifice of physical coherence in favor of totally artificial gameplay comfort. The problem here isn't the existence of these systems. That's standard in game development. It's their application, which is so unnatural it produces absurd situations. The AI in The Last of Us has nothing organic about it. Its rigidity pulls you right out of the experience. You work out a survival strategy, sure, but it's artificial. Ultimately, our actions are nothing more than mechanical triggers, forcing the next scene to advance. We're not surviving, we're executing a pre-written score. If the image shows us a rigid world, the sound does everything it can to make us believe in its depth. In a survival game, acoustics are 50% of the tension. But if you listen carefully, you start to feel the weight of the technical limitations of the era. To be clear, the surface work is solid. The audio engine does an excellent job differentiating textures. Your footsteps will sound different on wood, metal, sand, or snow. That's what we call audio spatialization. But the moment you look for systemic precision, it breaks down. There's a glaring lack of 3D sound occlusion. Technically, this means the engine doesn't calculate sound attenuation through physical obstacles. An impact behind a thick window can sound just as clear as if there were no obstacle at all. the sensation of real volume and environmental mass collapses instantly. But the real problem for an attentive ear are the loops. In calm phases, the ambient sounds and guitar riffs run on very short samples. After a few minutes of standing still, the loop becomes noticeable. The repetition breaks the illusion, and you realize you're listening to a skipping record. Even stranger, there are totally artificial sound triggers. I call it the ghost sound, effects that fire in isolation, with no visible physical source in the world. And don't get me started on water. Throw an object into a puddle, and don't expect a dynamic impact calculation. The game simply reads a standard audio file via a trigger, a fixed file that doesn't adapt to the force, the angle, or the mass of the object. You could tell me I'm nitpicking, that these details weren't a priority in the production pipeline. That's probably true. These features were likely in the backlog and deprioritized, but for a title that sells itself on extreme realism and total immersion, this lack of acoustic reactivity betrays the machine. The sound wraps around you, sure, but it doesn't respond to you. It's a beautiful audio layer placed over an inert world, not a physical reaction to events. Once again, we're inside a world that is entirely pre-recorded. To hide the repetition of assets and the poverty of certain sets, Naughty Dog had to get clever with light. This is where you see the fracture between inspired artistic direction and limited technical execution. Interior lighting is probably the most successful element thanks to dynamic lighting. The contrast between shadow zones and punctual light sources creates a heavy atmosphere that works perfectly. But there's a flip side. The studio relies heavily on what's called static lighting, or baked lighting. Simply put, it's pre-cooked light. Technically, a large part of the light you see was pre-calculated during development and baked directly into the textures via light maps. The systemic consequence is radical. The world is a dead photograph. Knock over a desk lamp, shoot a light source, and the shadow on the floor won't move a single millimeter. The system doesn't calculate light in real time. It simply displays a fixed pre-recorded image. Step outside, and the inconsistencies become obvious. Natural light looks credible at first glance, but it's inert. Vegetation assets and background sets don't react dynamically to ambient lighting. Worse, distant scenery is often just flat 2D sprites that clash with the level of detail on the characters. Look at the reflections. In 2013, without ray tracing, the studio used fake reflections. Mirrors and windows display static 2D textures that don't reflect the player's actual position or the changing state of the environment. Pure trompe-l'oeil. As for weather effects like rain, pure visual scripting. Raindrops on windows follow pre-calculated trajectories with no physical impact on the world. Dust and smoke particles, though pretty, vanish abruptly the moment the explosion script ends. No systemic persistence. Wind doesn't move the smoke. Debris doesn't stay on the ground. The lighting in The Last of Us works like professional makeup on a tired actor. From a distance, it's sublime and cinematic. But up close, you see the seams, the fixed reflections, the evaporating particles, revealing the artificial nature of every shot. You're not walking through a world, you're walking through a succession of static paintings. The biggest gap in The Last of Us isn't necessarily between the polygons, It's between the action and the narrative. This is what we call narrative dissonance, that precise moment where the game system and the story no longer talk to each other. When you analyze the vocal interactions, you realize that dialogue suffers from a severe lack of contextualization. NPCs talk as if every scene exists in its own bubble, whether you're sneaking in complete silence or just triggered total chaos with a shotgun. The conversations don't adapt. These are text blocks placed side by side, completely disconnected from your gameplay. As a player, you're not an actor in the dialogue. You're just the technician crossing an invisible line to trigger the next audio track. This disconnect shows up all the way down to the technical micro details. Look closely at background textures or minor props. They're often rough or outright inconsistent. You can feel that all the polish was concentrated on the heroes' faces and foreground objects. The rest of the world, left in a state of neglected theater set. Blood and water animations completely ignore the topology of surfaces. Collisions are so partial that you literally walk through vegetation without it moving. This is a textbook example of what developers call low priority tasks, identified tasks, present in the backlog, but never prioritized during sprints because they were considered unimportant to the overall experience. I imagine all these reactivity features were listed by the teams and flagged by QA, but given the hardware of the era and release date constraints, they ended up at the bottom of the pile. For a title that sells itself entirely on dramatic immersion, this lack of systemic reactivity starts to weigh on you. It creates that feeling of a dead world, just waiting for you to walk past it, to mechanically come to life. In summary, the writing in this game is a straight line carved in stone, blind to your actions. Between these robotic dialogues and these unfinished micro details, the game constantly reminds us of a cold truth. We are walking through a series of pre-calculated paintings, rather than a truly organic adventure. One quick aside before we continue. I want to be clear. I'm not judging the quality of the story itself here. Whether the narrative is classic or derivative of other literary or cinematic works is not the point. Passing judgment on the plot would mean letting emotion speak, and emotion has no place here. What matters to us is the engineering of the narrative, not its emotional value. If the game systems are rigid, Naughty Dog excels in one very specific area: object-based storytelling. This is what gives a kind of soul to these scripted corridors. Beyond the cutscenes, the game relies heavily on environmental storytelling. Technically, it's the act of telling a story through asset placement: a skeleton in a bathtub, a child's letter, or graffiti on a wall. What's interesting from an engineering standpoint is that these are static elements. They cost virtually nothing in processing resources, but they fill the gap left by the world's lack of real interactivity. The same logic applies to tape recorders, classic audio logs that add narrative depth without ever impacting gameplay. You listen, but you don't play. This is where the studio pulls off its greatest trick, transforming a mechanically dead world into a place that feels inhabited through micro-interactions. But don't be fooled. Despite the marketing language of the time, we're not dealing with an AI that decides to act on its own. Technically, Ellie runs on a finite state machine. To understand the illusion, imagine two concrete examples. First example, you stop in a corridor. After 10 seconds of inactivity, Ellie's idle timer hits 0. The code randomly picks from an animation bank, like pulling out her magazine. But if you're pressed against a wall, she'll do it anyway, even if the magazine clips straight through the brick. Why? Because the AI doesn't see the obstacle. It simply executes a binary order. If idle time equals 10 seconds, play animation_magazine. Second example, the whistling. That's not a mood, that's contextual scripting. The studio places invisible trigger zones on the ground. The moment Ellie enters one of these zones, the system shifts her probability table. The whistle animation goes from 0% to 30% chance of being selected by the timer. It's not Ellie taking an interest in the world, it's the world forcing Ellie to play a specific animation based on where she's standing. That said, to be honest, these are mechanics seen across the entire industry. For a game selling revolutionary immersion, that's somewhat disappointing. You can feel the lack of effort in pure gameplay design. The studio simply applies basic recipes. The strength of this title doesn't lie in its inventiveness, but in the quality of its execution. This technical polish is so well done that it makes us forget the poverty of the innovation underneath and the desperately conventional rails we're running on. We can't close this autopsy without addressing the psychological dimension. If the second game is a clinical study on trauma, the first one rests on a more primitive mechanic, the engineering of bond construction. In this first game, the psychology of the characters is entirely subservient to a linear narrative arc, grief and redemption. Joel functions here as an emotional automaton, a system whose variables are locked by past trauma. His contact with Ellie isn't a random interaction. It's the script trigger that progressively unlocks his empathic functions. It's predictable pattern writing, calibrated to the standards of the film industry. The neuroses are identified, the motivations are clear, and the evolution follows a track with no possible deviation. One of the central themes of this structure, one will find in a more sophisticated form in the second game, is dehumanization through survival. Technically, the game system imposes a vision where Joel doesn't perceive his enemies as individuals with complex AI or lives of their own, but as mechanical obstacles. This total absence of empathy toward the other is a gameplay necessity. It allows the game to maintain cold, utilitarian violence without ever creating friction with the character's psyche or the player's. The game conditions us to this violence without ever implementing a mechanism for questioning it. We also observe a phenomenon of affective substitution transfer. In the screenplay engineering, Ellie is not treated as an independent partner. She's integrated as a repair variable. For Joel, she represents a chance to correct a system error, his past failure with the asset called Sarah. This isn't an organic bond, it's a psychological maintenance bond. And it's precisely this second chance logic that makes Joel so dangerous. Why? Because his internal code doesn't ask him to protect Ellie for who she is, but for what she symbolizes in his own broken mental structure. Ultimately, it's this obsession with not losing again that drives the entire logic of his final decision. Finally, there's the implementation of the lie as a preservation tool. The game ends on a breach of trust, a manipulation where Joel imposes his reality on Ellie. This isn't just a dramatic device, it's the creation of an information asymmetry that defines the entire narrative engineering of the second game. We move from a system of cooperation to a system built on a relational flaw. I'll stop there for this section. This paternal journey follows rails too conventional to merit deeper dissection at this stage. The true systemic rupture, where the psyche becomes a brutal game mechanic, that's in the second game. That's where we'll truly dig into the subject. In the meantime, let's return to the coldness of the machine and tackle the core of the experience, the gameplay. If we focus on pure gameplay, we touch the heart of the paradox. The combat and stealth mechanics are functional. Whether you go for brutal action or silent infiltration, it delivers real enjoyment. It's classic, but it works. The problem is that it lacks systemic depth. We're locked into an extremely rigid loop. Loot, craft, combat. Every encounter feels like a puzzle, with one predetermined solution. You're not surviving in a reactive ecosystem. You're moving through a series of disconnected combat zones. Your interactions with the environment are minimal. Move a ladder, push a raft, binary actions, with no emergent physics. For a title selling total realism, this lack of effort in mechanic design is glaring. Take real-time crafting. It's a good idea for tension. But technically, it comes down to a progress bar that freezes your character in a fixed animation. No evolution, no surprise. You can feel the gameplay isn't there to offer freedom. But the ultimate proof that we're inside an assisted simulation is what I call the invisible hand. Adaptive loot. Behind the looting of bodies, randomness is just a technical facade. The studio uses a form of contextual loot. The engine monitors your inventory, and if your resources drop below a certain threshold, it adjusts drop probabilities to prevent a dead end. And this slider is obviously tied to your difficulty level. On normal, the script's mercy is constant to guarantee the spectacle. On hard or realistic, the game radically lowers these thresholds, making scarcity much more real. But the control logic remains identical. The game manages your stock to manipulate your stress curve. The goal is psychological. Keep you in an illusion of scarcity without ever hitting the soft lock that would break the narrative rhythm. It's invisible regulation. The system doesn't give you what's logically present in the world. It calculates what it can give you to keep the experience tense but possible. Once again, the triumph of script over simulation. This is a deeply conservative design philosophy. Naughty Dog chose to secure a stable and predictable experience, rather than risk complex systems that might have broken the staging. The gameplay is effective, but it serves the script, never the other way around. We're not the actors of our own survival, we're the executors of a pre-written choreography. If we look at the HUD, we find the same studio philosophy, efficiency above all. The inventory is clear, navigation is fluid, but the whole thing remains absolutely rigid. The minimalist interface, what we call the invisible HUD, is there to favor total immersion, to make sure you never take your eyes off the film. But behind this aesthetic choice, there's an extremely rigid lootcraft combat gameplay loop. Real-time crafting, as stressful as it is just a disguised progress bar that freezes your character in a repetitive animation. This brings us to something rarely discussed, yet it's a technical pillar in its own right. Ergonomics, the science of interaction between a user and their tool. And it's fundamental, because depending on your profile, your abilities, your sensitivity, this interaction can be fluid or completely broken. And here, it's broken for a lot of people, because the effort of adaptation is virtually non-existent. What's striking in hindsight, especially knowing what Naughty Dog has become in terms of accessibility is the total void on this subject. We're at absolute zero inclusion, a few difficulty options, a basic button remapping, that's it. Nothing for players with visual, motor, or hearing disabilities. The game imposes its physical and sensory rules, with no room for negotiation. At the time, this rigidity was claimed as an artistic choice, preserving the integrity of the director's vision. Translation: player comfort came after product consistency. We're facing a purely top-down ergonomic approach, a finished, rigid, closed object that deliberately ignores the diversity of its users to ensure that everyone experiences exactly the same sequence down to the millimeter. No adaptation, no flexibility. Just the studio's vision, imposed. Here's the final assessment. The Last of Us is a textbook case, a title that convinced millions of players they were witnessing a masterpiece, while resting on technically archaic foundations. An AI prisoner of its scripts, surface-level physics, a game design that plays it safe rather than innovating, the triumph of form over substance. There are points this autopsy didn't dissect, not by omission, but by choice. The technical performance of the remaster is clean, without rough edges, without particular interest to analyze. Animation and mocap are flawless in cutscenes, but the moment the player takes back control, the transitions reveal a character snapping from one state to another, with no real physical continuity. The body physics follow the same logic, convincing when the script keeps them on a leash, transparent the moment they're left to themselves. Allied AI works through disappearance. Tess, Ellie, they move through spaces, ignore collisions, exist only when the script needs them. Resource progression isn't a system, it's a staging of scarcity. And the music, precise, effective, but always in service of immediate emotion, never built as a language in its own right. It would be unfair not to acknowledge the scale of the work accomplished on pure sound. Hundreds of audio assets recorded for ambience, for every surface, every material, every environment. It's a colossal and rigorous effort. The limits I pointed out take nothing away from that work. They simply reveal the implementation choices that followed. But there is colder proof of these choices, proof that no one ever looks at the credits. 1,877 people worked on this title, and the distribution is the most honest autopsy of the studio's priorities. On the side of what works, the teams are massive. There's a very particular role in these credits, emotional systemic facial animator. Just that. An entire position dedicated to making a face convey emotion, systemically. Motion capture mobilizes several dozen people. And for sound, Naughty Dog didn't rely solely on internal teams. They brought in an entire external studio. Formosa, Interactive. The result is there. You've seen it. You've heard it. On the side of what doesn't work, it's silence. Browse these 1,877 names. Look for a dedicated AI programmer. Look for an in-house physics engineer, you won't find one. For physics, the studio simply integrated Havoc, a generic middleware. No proprietary development, no deep customization. That choice is in the credits. It explains the clipping. It explains the approximate collisions, and other things. And for accessibility, the number speaks for itself. 0 dedicated positions. But if you read all the way to the end, in the acknowledgements, you'll find 4 names: Joshua Straub, Ian Hamilton, Brandon Cole, Steve Saylor, recognized accessibility consultants in the industry. They were consulted, then thanked. They were never integrated into the team. That detail says everything. Accessibility wasn't a development pillar. It was a checkbox, an option that was outsourced and set aside. Finally, 9 external studios contributed assets to this game. That's not the problem. It's industry standard. The problem is what happens downstream. Behind every external studio, you need integrators, people whose role is to verify that every delivered asset respects the project's rules, scale, lighting consistency, level of detail. That's artistic quality assurance. And when you look at the credits, the supervision of these 9 studios rests on a single dedicated role: lead outsource artist. No specific integration team, no visible centralized artistic validation pipeline. Quality control on these assets was diluted across the general responsibilities of the art directors, who had hundreds of other things to supervise. The result? You saw it on screen: objects that don't share the same level of detail, textures that clash, background assets that break the coherence of entire zones. This isn't negligence, it's a priority that was never put on the table. The credits don't lie. Where there are people, there is quality. Where there is no one, there are the flaws. Everything was signed. No one had looked. And you know what? It works. It actually works. Every limit we dissected, every technical choice we exposed, none of it was enough to break the illusion. Millions of people walked through this theater of automatons and felt something real. Some saw the strings from the very first hour and could never unsee them. Others never saw them at all. Both readings are legitimate. This isn't a judgment. It's a mechanism. In the second game, these same mechanics stop being constraints and become intentions. We leave the world that simulates the living to enter a machine designed to produce psychological suffering. It's another autopsy, another level of dissection, and that's exactly where we're going in the next video. Thank you for following along for this first part. See you very soon.